So let's talk about the big Stratagem rules change and how it shakes things up for Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40k core gameplay changes once more. And this one I thought would focus particularly on the Stratagem change to captains and similar type abilities. I feel like the change is a particularly interesting one as it basically affects each individual army and detachment in different ways. It means that quite a lot of models and units could use reinterpreting. 10th edition was pretty interesting with the way that it treated captains and commanders. They were quite radically reinterpreted at the edition's start, then the rules were changed quite quickly from then, and now they've been changed en masse once more. It's really been a big change since 8th and 9th edition, when previously they weren't part of units, and you had the sort of them standing right next to units, and maybe in the middle of a formation, giving everything a big aura buff with their leadership command abilities. Standard captains often tended to have reroll ones to hit, but a few different ones from different factions worked a little bit differently to that. I did think that the broad change that happened in 8th edition though, when Games Workshop decided to make characters like that just a bit more efficient for actually making units damage directly better, was a pretty good change on the whole though. In previous editions it had perhaps been a bit more about just how individually hard they tended to fight. I did quite like the way that HQs offered more buffing rules, perhaps a bit of an abstraction for their tactical command abilities. I feel like Games Workshop would often tended to shy away a little bit more from the man in fancy hat somehow makes entire units shoot better sort of thing, but I quite like the way that it has a bit more of a punchy in-game effect, even if it might be representing them directing fields of fire efficiently and things. In 10th edition though, all that got radically changed. Independent characters suddenly became parts of units again, which to be honest did make sense for a lot of situations, particularly when charging things into combat, and lots of aura abilities went away, and instead generally got replaced en masse, often with free stratagems, though a few different commanders had different options. At the very start of 10th edition, the free stratagem type abilities that captain equivalents had tended to be generally very unrestricted. So basically a Space Marine captain would just have absolute free reign over their stratagems. They could do anything from doubling up on Overwatch to using 2 CP stratagems completely for free, and they weren't locked out of any detachment specific stratagems, unlike what happened shortly after. It meant that they perhaps tended to be really quite common picks in armies that could take them and had good ones, though to be honest I would have argued that they were far from the most unbalanced thing in early 10th edition, not when we had the likes of pre-nerf Eldari and Genestealer Cult running around. It seemed though that Games Workshop felt that the launch rule for captains and their equivalents were a bit too powerful, and they fairly rapidly got a rules reinterpretation in the first balance patch of 10th edition. I think people found it to be a bit of a peculiar change. The free stratagem type abilities would only apply to battle tactics, so one specific subset of stratagems as defined by their flavor text, and the same would be true to any of the abilities across the game that caused you to increase the cost of a stratagem. It did feel like a bit of an arbitrary change to me, and I think to quite a lot of people, it just really didn't seem that the type of stratagem had been in any way written for in terms of the way that detachments were structured, or even in terms of balance purposes. The way that Games Workshop appeared to have written them was that under the name of each stratagem, you have which detachment it could be used in, and then the type of stratagem that it was, for example battle tactics, epic deeds, or war gear stratagems, and that second bit of flavor text seemed to be more of a sort of law and feel type thing. For example, the war gear ones were ones where it was basically a unit deploys a specific bit of gear that they have, such as grenades or other similar sort of things. Sometimes they're keyword linked, but they're not always. And epic deeds tended to be the ones that were used more by characters, doing some sort of dramatic ability that maybe only a focal character would do. I'm not honestly as sure about the difference between strategic ploys and battle tactics, but certainly battle tactics felt like the sort of thing that you could expect a commander to issue an order for a squad to do, which maybe did to some extent mean that the captain sort of things going to this had some sort of sense, but it just didn't really seem to be a game design sense at all. It just seemed to be for a lore and theming, and that was just one way that they found that they could make them a bit weaker than they did before. Probably the main criticisms of that system were that the battle tactic stratagems really weren't evenly handed out between detachments. Some armies' detachments had almost nothing but battle tactics, say the Space Marine Firestorm Assault Force being a good example, and some had basically no usable ones. Maybe like the new version of the Custodian's Shield host, that one only had one battle tactic, so shield captains didn't really have too much to get their teeth into for their core rule on that. On top of that, it didn't look like the battle tactics were balanced for strength or anything like that, as they wound up rationing a bunch of them not to be battle tactics, such as a Knights and Custodies one. It maybe wasn't the end of the world, and it still meant that captains were pretty useful in plenty of detachments, but it definitely felt like a band-aid patch to me. Now though, in the latest balanced data slate, they've changed in quite a big way again. In the last update, they got hit by a trio of changes, basically amounting to 2 nerfs and a buff. For this video, I'm going to focus on the free stratagem sort of abilities, usually for unit leaders or things nearby. I know that the things with debuff stratagem abilities like the Calidus Assassin did get their abilities changed around to increase enemy CP cost nearby, which I think is interesting, but it's basically quite a different change to an entirely different set of units. The main buff of the captain rule though is that you can use all of those free stratagem abilities on things that aren't battle tactics anymore, which means that you open up a pretty massive amount of things from the core stratagems list that could be really quite useful in game. I feel like perhaps one of the single biggest and most impactful can be Overwatch, just given how that's often just giving you a little bit more extra damage in the opponent's turn, potentially kind of critical if you destroy something that was about to inflict damage itself. And on certain units it does look very fearsome indeed, perhaps things like big units of aggressors with lethal hits and things from an apothecary biologist, or certainly anything that's got torrent weapons and a captain leading it. Otherwise, heroic intervention genuinely seems kind of nice now for its 1 CP. That became way more important with units being able to threaten to protect each other, and captain ones will be able to do that without guilt if they haven't used the stratagem up to then. Otherwise, counter-offensive still costing 1 CP would be another good option. Grenade could be some fairly reliable extra mortal wound damage. Rapid Ingress is a particularly powerful one. Could be kind of nice if you could use that at the end of, say, Battle Round 2, and then have their free stratagem ready to go again for Battle Round 3, I guess. And otherwise you could get Precision via Epic Challenge, Insane Bravery, Go to Ground, or maybe occasionally Smokescreen and Tank Shock as well. They're a bit more limited though for abilities that can throw that at vehicles. Overall, I feel like just about every free stratagem ability in the game has expanded in the amount of reach it can get just due to that, but otherwise it is kind of detachment dependent. Perhaps the absolute biggest impact is for all the detachments that had stratagems that mainly weren't battle tactics, and Captain type HQs have been able to go from basically being able to use none of them to suddenly being able to access lots. I'll talk about a few of those in a second. For example, for a winner from the change though, I did talk about Canis Rex in a previous video. Previously, his battle tactics locked thing meant that he could only use his free stratagem on the command point reroll or the 2 command point once per game general knight buff. Both of those are definitely pretty impactful on a big stompy knight like him, but not quite as big a scope as you might hope for. Now he's just got vastly more options for that free stratagem each battle round. Probably the most obvious one is rotate ion shields for 4+ invulnerable save, and he could use that basically whenever he gets targeted by big scary anti-tank weapons. But also you could use free tank shock, even if it's only going to be 12 dice, not more. Epic challenge just to precision out enemy characters with ridiculous melee. Thunderstorm from the main detachment, and then 1 command point for counter-offensive trophy claim or valiant last stand, all of which might put them in significantly better reach for him compared with elsewhere. The only nerf is that 2 command point once per game boost will now cost 1 CP. It makes that one a fair bit less interesting for him, though still not terrible given the 2+ save. I feel like he's 1 overall. On the downside though, there were basically 2 different nerfs to the free battle tactics abilities. The first one is that the stratagems are no longer outright free, they're just a -1 CP to the cost of them, and that basically means that if you had any 2 CP battle tactic stratagems that you were regularly using or setting out to use with the captain, then those ones are a lot more mediocre for the overall combo. Often they were some of the absolute best value ones that you could use the captain ability on, given that you were essentially saving yourself 2 CP rather than 1, but now the overall setup might just not be worth it unless that stratagem is just crazily good if you're only saving 1 CP on it, and you're still needing to buy the captain in to get the discount, then it just might not be overall as worth it versus just going with other options. One unit that's lost out from this is the popular Gravis Captain with Flamestorm Aggressors type combo. Captains were quite often taken there due to the free devastating wound that they could get on those twin flamers. Really quite massive value, but a bit of a commitment if you didn't have a captain. Now if you want to use that one, even if you do have a Gravis Captain with your Flamestorms, then it's going to cost you 1 command point. Still very scary, but that big combo's been nerfed. In Firestorm it overall makes that feel like a loss really, given that the rest of the tactics were basically battle tactic stratagems anyway. I suppose if you do want to look at the bright side, it does mean that the Gravis Captain and Flamestorm Aggressors could get free Overwatch potentially, which is 1 gain. I feel like it's probably a loss overall though. Otherwise, the second nerf is that you're no longer able to double up on a stratagem anymore, unless it's specifically called out by name by the ability. Never mind the free stratagem, that was actually kind of powerful on the point of captain type abilities before. It meant that if you just had 1 scary or very directly useful stratagem, then you might be able to have 2 copies of it happening in the same phase. and this does mean that it's kind of a slight nerf to further one command point battle tactic stratagems. Anything that was good enough that you might conceivably have wanted to use it twice in the same phase, once for free and once for one command point on a different unit, paying the full cost. Perhaps one example where that might be felt is the Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius detachment. They often like to use captains and use their Red Rampage melee stratagem, lance melee and lethal hits for the unit, which makes a unit hit spectacularly hard. Now you're only going to be able to do that on one unit per turn, even if you had two units where it really made sense to use that buff, so that does feel like it's one nerf there. Another potential one for Space Marines in general is Armour of Contempt. It was quite nice to be able to access for free for a captain if you hadn't used the stratagem on anything else, and then be free to use that on something else like a big tank or vehicle as well in the same phase if it made sense. It does just mean that a bit of value is being lost out of that rule. Overall, I think it's an interesting change though, basically getting one big boost that's likely to help just about every single captain, but also getting two nerfs that might be really quite bad news for certain characters depending on the situation. It just means whether or not it's a good or bad change, it's just highly specific on the unit being used and the detachment that they're in. I thought it could be fun just to take a look through 5 examples. I'm not going to go through literally every single one of the captain type equivalents in Warhammer 40k, but I thought it could be fun just to take a look at a few of them. For shield captains, I'd say that the change has been largely overall positive. Being able to just heroic intervene for free I think is genuinely pretty good for custodies. Often a unit might well be able to seriously threaten to maul one unit of custodian guard or something, but I feel like it's very few things in the game that can seriously hold their own against two units of custodies at once. And if you've got your units fairly close to each other, you could potentially just step up and intervene and force the opponents to essentially charge both of them or none at all. Rapid Ingress could be nice for them with their Deep Strike, and so could Epic Challenge to take out enemy heroes. Even Overwatch could be nice in a pinch, particularly if you're getting the rerolls for Custodian Guard. For detachments though, I feel like it might actually be a nerf overall in the Talons of the Emperor. Most of those stratagems were battle tactics already, so it means that you can't double up on those quite as easily, and there was a nice 2 CP one for a +1 to wound. That's only going to be 1 CP now, even if you've got a captain. There just doesn't seem to be as much game for that one, though I guess you can use the ability on fallback, shoot and charge, and it still will be useful for the other stratagems. On the other hand though, it looks like it's a big win for shield captains in Auric Champions and Shield Host. Shield Host was a weird one in that it sort of incentivized shield captains with the Castellan's Mark, but then it only gave you one battle tactic stratagem to use with it. The rest of them were all strategic ploys, so now the shield captains have got all sorts of choice for ways to influence the game, and they still have that Castellan's Mark for the redeploys, even if it isn't quite as powerful as it was. It perhaps feels even more impactful for Auric Champions, which is the one that's built around characters. That one seemed like it was in a very awkward place, basically trying to build around the Custodian's character and leader choices, and then making all the stratagems epic deeds, so your default character and the shield captain couldn't access any of them for free. Just felt very odd overall. Otherwise, for Necron Overlords, feels like they've improved in some of them. Again, they can use some of the ones that are just nice generic ones, like Heroic Intervention, or Epic Challenge, or Overwatch. I guess Overwatch could be a quite nice one to have for free for things like Tesla Immortals and things. Built-in rerolls and sustained hits on 6s and things seems like that's pretty good there. For detachments though, it feels like the biggest winner on the Overlord front is the Awakened Dynasty. That's already got a focus on characters leading units, but didn't really have all that many battle tactics. So now you can use it on things like the Undying Legions one, where you can resurrect D3+1 wounds after a unit's been attacked, or could trigger that reactive shooting ability for 1 CP. I feel like for 2 CP it was very rarely ever worth it. Otherwise, for Hypercrypt, you could now Cosmic Precision for free with an Overlord unit, which is interesting. And I feel like the big 1 command point Charge Atter and Monolith seems like it could genuinely be kind of fun with a Overlord and Lich Guard. Seems like a pretty guaranteed way of delivering a unit into combat unless the enemy actually manages to do the work to pop the Monolith. Canoptek Court feels less relevant, bar things like Overwatch, and it seems like it's a bit whatever for Obeisance Phalanx, where I wasn't particularly convinced about these stratagems in the first place, and it already had a fair few battle tactics that you now can't double up on. For the Guard, Creed's an interesting one. You can use 1 0 CP stratagem on a regiment unit within 12 inches, so that's infantry, cavalry and sentinels for the most part, and previously she was a bit of a competitive staple as an auto-include in a lot of lists. Pair her with a backfield mortar, and she could hand out fields of fire to debuff one enemy unit for -1 AP. But now she's lost out in a fairly big way on that. Her fields of fire will now cost 1 CP, even if you have Creed and the units to hand out the stratagem. Still seems usable, particularly with Lord Solar handing out more command points and maybe less being spent on reinforcements, unfortunately. But that overall setup took a hit. It definitely doesn't look quite as auto-include as it was. She has gained a few options. You could Overwatch or Grenade potentially, or do that one where you use an extra order in the enemy command phase for +1 to your saves or better objective control or something, and Suppression Fire could be alright, handing out a -1 to hit. Overall, she still probably feels a character that has got worse overall in the update though. Commander Farsight for the Tau, he got switched to being a free stratagem unit come the Tau Codex, and is probably just looking a bit better in general given that all the battlesuit units dropped down a bit. Overall, I feel like he's won out at least on the free stratagem change. Free rapid ingress seems really quite desirable. That could help his units get within the range that he needs to trigger his +1 to wound debuff. And if maybe he's used his free stratagem on your turn where he's jumped out and hit something, then being able to trigger Overwatch on the turn after also seems very nice. Perhaps particularly if you're triggering the Fire Knife rerolls on the target, that means that you could get a fairly decent amount of shooting in the enemy turn. Otherwise, Heroic Intervention, maybe Tank Shock even if it's on his lower toughness characteristic, and Epic Challenge could all be okay. For the detachments though, it doesn't really seem like he's done that great in Montcar and Cao Yon. Both of those had lots of one command point battle tactics, and maybe it just affects the ability to double those up for the most part, otherwise gains are kind of minimal. The Retaliation Cadre seems like a win for him. He could use the shortened blade one for the 3-inch deep strike for one command point, and that's exactly what he really wants to be doing to get his +1 to wound buff off, getting in extra close, and also triggering the detachment rules as well. The other ones may feel a little bit peripheral with things like stim injectors, torch star, and the grab inhibitor things, but I guess there might be a bit more use for them if they're in the right situation and he hadn't already needed to use the free stratagem on something different. Overall, feels like he didn't do too badly out of the changes, even if he will miss tank shocking on the strength of the Dawnblade. Finally, for the Tyranids, I thought that the Hive Tyrant was a pretty interesting one. He's got a 0 CP ability that can go on any unit within 12 inches, which is perhaps one of the most de-restricted ones beyond things like Gilliman. And they also gave the Hive Tyrant a bit of significant other help in the data slate as well, with the +1 to strength from Synapse being really quite good for a strength 10 Bone Saber, and the lethal hit aura when shooting is rather good as well, particularly nice for mid-strength things like Exocrine Fire. For the actual stratagem changes though, given that they can apply to so many different units, a fair few things are really quite usable. Tyranids don't really have all that much access to the core stratagems due to keywords and things, but firing Overwatch again seems like a really big win. You could have it on one of the big gun bugs. Again, lethal hits Exocrines could certainly be interesting enough to do that on, particularly if just one failed save could be a big difference. Maybe destroying the last of an enemy vehicle, or killing an important elite infantry that was just about to deal damage. That seems very nice on a Tyrannofex with Acid Spray as well. Heroic Intervention also seems like a rather nice one as well. It means that a fairly large portion of the central swarm of Tyranids could potentially step up to help each other in melee, and that could cause headaches for the opponent when they're charging. Otherwise, for detachment things, I feel like the biggest loss might be to Invasion Fleet. Previously, you could double up on the 5+ Feel No Pain stratagem, and that often meant that you could have two units just unusually tanky against enemy fire. Now you'd only be able to get that on one unit, and Adrenal Surge took a small nerf as well, where even with the Hive Tyrant that'll still cost 1 CP rather than 2. He did get more options for the free stratagem, like replenishing Termagants, fighting on death, flexing adaptations out, which is quite a nice one, and Overrun. I feel like even with all of those though, it's still probably a bit of a side grade just due to how good the Feel No Pain one was. For the other detachments, there's plenty of interesting stuff though. Vanguard Onslaught had 4 strategic ploys that are now essentially no different to battle tactics, so it could be fun for the Winged Hive Tyrant there. Synaptic Nexus can access fallback shoot and charge, and swapping around to a different imperative, which is fairly nice, but it does mean that you can't double down on that reroll 1s versus 1 marked target stratagem. Again, that one was a particularly nice one. And Unending Swarm was mainly 1 command point battle tactics. They do have a couple of extra ones. That one certainly changed quite a bit. It took a big hit with the reinforcement stratagem, but having strength 4 Hormagaunts, plus a few buffs to some other Tyranid units, might at least have a chance of it not being out of the running as much. Overall, probably isn't the end of the world, as Hive Tyrants just clearly got better with the lethal hits and the +1 strength thing. It does feel like they maybe gained relevance in some detachments more so than others though. I feel like it was perhaps a little bit of a side grade in Invasion Fleet, though being able to do things like Overwatch and Heroic Intervention on big units is pretty scary. In any case though, let me know what you think of the change. I know I've not covered literally every single caption equivalent in 40k here, plenty more that I could have talked about, so feel free to let me know your thoughts on any of the others. Will your captains, caranesses and overlords be seeing more time on the table or not after this change? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.